Hello everybody and welcome to the first live presentation of the Vine and Wine Mooc. This week we'll be focusing on vine biology, which is the first module. By way of introduction, my name is Tom. I'm from England and I'm a student here at Montpellier Supergrow on the Viticulture and Enology Vinifera Masters Programme. I'm joined here by Eumorphia.
Hello, I'm Eumorphia, I'm from Greece. I also study Montpellier Supergrow and the Vinifera Programme. And we're here in the first module of the Mooc, Vine and Wine, which is focused on vine biology.
So joining us today are three professors. So the first of which is Alain Deloire, who is beside me now. And we also have Gregory Gambetta and Kees van Leuven from Bordeaux Sciences Agro, who will be joining us from a distance. So we've had a lot of questions. We'll try to get through them in the 30 minutes that are allotted. But before we started, we wanted just to say a few words about languages. We remind you that we have subtitles in English and Mandarin, and that a PDF has been put online, which everybody can contribute to writing up afterwards. We'd like to just remind you before we start that we do have an additional Mooc in French, which commences in half an hour's time. If you wish to take notes during the live, you can do so below the video. So, to start off.
Question for you, Mr. Delon, by Anonymous. Why is that during the first stage of growth, the berry remains green? Is it because of chlorophyll? And when does chlorophyll disappear from the berry?
Well, that's an interesting question. Yes, the greenness of the berry skin is due to chlorophyll. And the chlorophyll starts to disappear around veraison, which is the onset of berry ripening, which is berry softening.
Okay, a second question, which I believe is for you as well, Alain. So if flowering is over 2 years, why is it that the grapes are harvested every year?
Oh yes, that's an interesting question as well. I think that people, they have to understand that during the same year, at the level of a primary shoot which is growing, two events occur. The first one is the elaboration of the crop of the current year. And the second event is the preparation of the crop of next year. So the crop of the current year is due to the differentiation of flowers and to the growth of berries on those flowers. And within the latent bud, you have the preparation of the crop for the next year. Greg, do you want to add something on top of that?
Yeah, Case is just about to join me here. Yeah, I think that what students need to understand is that the clusters on a grapevine, they're actually formed. This is Case Van Leuven, who's just joining us. Come and sit down, Case. They're actually formed the season before, and so this idea that crop is a 2-year process, that's because the fact that the grape cluster is actually pre-formed in the little bud, and then that overwinters. And then when that bud pushes the next following season, those clusters come out and they form the current year's clusters. So as that current year crop is developing and ripening, and we're going to make wine out of those grapes, there's buds that are then left on the vine. Those are the buds that have the little clusters in them for the following season. So this is the idea of when you think about grape yield, it is a 2-year. It's a 2-year process, and that the grape clusters are actually formed the previous season.
Okay. And does a berry correspond with an inflorescence? And so a grape is a flower? Can you go back over the flowering process and redefine clearly what is an inflorescence?
Yes, the inflorescence is going to bear the flowers. Okay, so on each inflorescence you have, let's say, to give an example, something like 200, 300, something like 500 flowers. And some of those flowers will give, each flowers will give a berry, a fruit. So each flower is corresponding to a fruit, to a future fruit.
Okay. So moving on, another question for you, Alain. So why is it that during the first stage of growth, the berry remains green? Is this due to chlorophyll?
Yes, we got the question at the beginning of the interview, and it's important perhaps to say it again, but yes, it's due to chlorophyll, and you have the inflorescences themselves, they are green. They are able to produce carbohydrates, and the fruit from berry set to veraison is green because of chlorophyll. And the change of color will happen at veraison. Veraison is the beginning of ripening.
Okay. So another question. You tell us that a vine can sweat up to 50 liters of water a day. What do you mean by a vine? What is the unit? A berry, a row, a plot? These questions for you, Greg.
So it's to do with the transpiration of water, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. The vines are working. They're working hard out there in the vineyards. So yeah, the question of 50 liters of water a day. I think what the question, I imagine what the student is imagining is that's a lot of water, and that must depend. I think the student who asked this question also said that must depend on the environment too, and indeed it does. So when we're talking about when I mention that figure. What I'm referring to is a full-sized grapevine in a vineyard with a full canopy. So all those leaves on a bright sunny day in the middle of summer. So obviously the amount of water that a vine uses is dependent on the environment. It's dependent mainly on the temperature and the humidity. So when these things two are taken together, they basically equal the atmospheric suck that sucks the water through the vine. We refer to this thing as a vapor pressure deficit, but that's kind of a technical term. But so the warmer it is, the drier it is, the more that grapevine is going to transpire. And when it's dry and when it's hot in the middle of summer, vines can use an enormous amount of water.
As long as there's water available in the soil, of course.
Exactly. Yeah. So Kays brings up a good point, which is one of the things that makes transpiration decrease, of course, is when they actually have a water deficit. So if they have the water available, they'll transpire it. But the moment that the water becomes limiting in the soil profile, one of the first things the vine does is it starts to shut down transpiration to conserve water. So that figure of 50 liters of water a day, that's kind of like a maximum, just to give students an idea of the magnitude of how much water a vine can potentially use. And then under a lot of circumstances, it's going to use less.
And so, Gregory, just to be clear on the point of a grapevine, when we talk about transpiration from a grapevine, we're talking about one plant within a row as opposed to sort of a whole row itself or a plot. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I'm referring to one plant in a row. Yeah, and it's I find that sometimes students have a hard time imagining that one grapevine could use that much water in a day. It seems kind of like a huge number, but it's with water availability on a dry, warm day. Indeed, they use a lot of water.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Thank
you
you
can
for
also
that.
transform it on the. You can also transform it on the per hectare basis. It can be say 3 or 5 milliliter per day, which is the equivalent of 3 or 4 liter per square meter. So you have 10,000 square meters per hectare. So a plot of vines on a per hectare basis can transpire something like 30 or 40,000 liters a day, which is quite a bit of water.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay, Gregory, we have another question for you here. So this one is, over how many seasons does the implementation of water stress take place?
Yeah, water stress is it's happening right then and there, right? So water stress is something that occurs right in the present season because there's not enough water. and the vine reacts to that water stress in various ways. One of the things we just mentioned was it reduces its transpiration to conserve water. There's other things that it does. Its effects on the fruit is it reduces fruit yields. And for wine grapes, tends to increase the quality of them, especially in red wine grapes. But it has multiple season effects, right? So even though it's happening right now in this season, the water stress has an effect, can have an effect in subsequent seasons. And we actually, in terms of the science, this is something that's not super well understood. We know that it can have negative impacts on yield, over subsequent seasons if you keep stressing and stressing your vines, and possibly on longevity of the vine, but I don't think we really know. Lynn or Case, do you have anything to add about the multi-seasonality of water stress?
Well, a point which is well studied is the effect of water stress on the yield for the coming year, because in the previous question, Greg talked about the small bunches which are already present in the grape buds, and recently it has been shown that if the vines are water stressed when these small bunches are formed in the buds, which is around between mid-May and mid-June in the previous season on the northern hemisphere, and that can reduce the number of small bunches which are present in the grape. So the effect on yield is pretty well understood, but the effect of quality is, if there is an effect on quality for the next season, is not clear yet.
Okay, thank you. A question for Guy about the position of the vineyard. What is the influence of the vineyard's position on ripening? For example, a vineyard in the bottom of a valley and a vineyard on a hillside.
So the position of there's a relation between the type of the soil and the position of the soil in the landscape with regard to the topography. So because of a process which is called erosion, where the soil tends to move down the slopes and accumulate in lower positions, the soils are thicker in a downslope position than in an upslope position. So that means that the soils are more fertile down the slope and less fertile up the slope in general. Of course, there are a few exceptions, but this is the general rule. Another point is that water is moving down the slope, so on the lower parts there can be problems with waterlogging, which tends to give unlimited water uptake to the vines. So generally speaking, the vines on the valley floor and in downslope positions tend to be more vigorous, more productive, but because of the higher vigor, maturity may be delayed, and in particular in cool climates, this can give quality problems. For instance, in Burgundy, which is typically a slope vineyard, it's clear that the highest quality of the grapes is obtained in the mid-slope position, where the soils are more shallow and in a certain way poorer, so there's less water available and less nutrients, which makes the vigor lower and the yield lower. The quality is definitely higher than in the downslope positions, where the soil is richer and there's more water available, and so where maturity can be delayed.
Okay. So perhaps, Alan, you want to respond to this question. What is a cultivar?
A cultivar is the name of the grapevine variety, like Chardonnay or Cabernet Sauvignon. Chardonnay is a white cultivar, is a white variety. Chenin Blanc is a white variety. Sauvignon Blanc is a white variety. And just to mention a few red varieties, we can mention Merlot or Cabernet Sauvignon or Shiraz. Yep.
Okay. And just a little reminder for everybody watching that we do have the glossary that everyone can complete. So you'll find the link to that in the forum, and there should be some more key definitions in there.
Could you please explain a bit what you mean by heterozygosity, and why is it not common to produce grapevines from seeds? Greg?
I'll start with the question about seeds, because this is kind of interesting. We don't produce grapevines from seeds because we want to ensure that the grapevines that we're planting are exactly the cultivar or the cépage in French, exactly the type of vine that we want, the kind of type of fruit that we want. So when we have a clone, say we have Cabernet Sauvignon clone number whatever it is, 14 or whatever, we produce the next plants by propagating wood to ensure that that next plant is genetically completely identical to that last Cabernet Sauvignon clone that we had. A seed is formed from sexual reproduction, right? In plants, just like animals, and all things, every time you have sexual reproduction, you introduce genetic diversity into the organism. This is what is meant by heterozygosity. Heterozygosity means every living organism has two alleles of something. It means that those two alleles of a gene are different from one another. This means that there's more diversity genetically within the organism. So, so for grapevines, and for many, many crop plants actually, we propagate them via wooding cuttings and not seeds to ensure the fact that genetically they maintain that purity over time.
So the point is, if ever you cross a Pinot Noir with a Pinot Noir, the seedlings will not give Pinot Noir. So in fact, if you want to maintain the variety, you have to do it by vegetative propagation.
Okay. So the next question, either for Gregory or for Kees, is on the position. Oh no, I beg your pardon. We'll move on to the question for Alan. So Alan, how does climate change affect dormancy in grapevines now that winters are often warmer and shorter?
Oh, okay. We'll try to answer, and perhaps Greg and Kees can add on top of what I'm going to say. Because of climate change, well, let's start with dormancy. To break the dormancy during winter, you need a certain sum of cool temperature. And if you don't have enough cool temperature during winter, the dormancy is not broken. Dormancy is very complex because you have three types of dormancies. So you need, to make a long story short, you need cool temperature during winter to break dormancy and to get an homogeneous bud break, bud growth during spring. So if you don't have enough cool temperature during winter, which can happen because of climate evolution where we see that in some regions, winters, they became a bit warmer, then the bud break will be delayed or will be heterogeneous. Does Greg or Kees, do you want to add on top of that? Because dormancy is quite complex, indeed.
Yeah. So dormancy is a strategy for perennial plants that they can lose their leaves during the winter when they are exposed to winter frost and have a new canopy coming out during the next spring. But that means that the buds which will give the new canopy in the spring, they are formed during the previous season. Now the plant has to ensure that these buds which are formed during the previous season, that they do not develop during the first season when they are made on the shoot. And so that means that as soon as these buds are formed, they go into dormancy. And they need, as Alain explained, they need a sum of low temperatures for dormancy release. And only after dormancy release, they can develop in the spring and give new shoots and leaves. So that now with climate change, the temperatures are increasing and the winters are milder. So in the first stage, that means that the budding of the grapes will be earlier and earlier. We already see in France where in many regions budding used to be around half May. With climate change, these dates have been advancing by 2 or 3 weeks, and it's now very common to see budding taking place in March. But at one stage when the temperatures will be really increasing during the winter, we may not reach the necessary sum of cold temperatures to have dormancy release. And then on the contrary, budding may be delayed in the spring because the dormancy is not released, and so the buds will remain dormant, and even with high temperature in spring, they will not develop, or there will be a very irregular development. This is already happening in some places with very mild winters in some parts of South Africa and in Western Australia, the growers have problems with dormancy release. Now there have been spraying products which have been developed to release the dormancy. Alain, you've worked in South Africa and in Australia. Are you familiar with those products like Dormex, which is a sort of artificial way to provoke dormancy release? Are you familiar with these products?
Yeah, it's used as you said, but for example, in South Africa, there is another strategy they do use is not to put anymore some varieties, early varieties in this sort of regions where you can have a mild winter, as you said. So yeah, you have it's used, but it's not really something which is nice for the environment. And one strategy, and that's a discussion, could be to really try to adapt the variety. If I may add on top of that, not to add complexity, what is interesting is grapevine is a liana, so the growth of a vine can be continuous, and that's something we see in tropical areas where you have a continuous growth. So this is where really people are using the products as Dormex. It's mainly used as well for table grape in warm climate, where people they want to crop twice a year, for example. Yeah, so this is where Dormex is mainly used. Does it make sense?
But it's not very good for the environment, I think.
I
Dormex,
think so.
it's
Yeah.
hydrogen cyanamide,
Yes,
the active principle, and
yes,
it has some issues with
Toxicity.
toxicity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You let me go back a bit because there's a question. What is the difference between cultivar and variety?
Oh, to me it's the same. Greg and Keith. Cultivar, variety, cepage is the same.
Yeah,
For me, it's synonymous.
Yeah, exactly. They're synonyms of one another, so they mean the exact same thing. A cultivar in varieties.
It's a cépage in French.
It's a cépage in French. There's only one word, I believe, in French is cépage.
Yeah.
And then you can say variété in French.
Variété. See? Okay, there you go. So, and in English, a variety and a cultivar means exactly the same thing. A Cabernet Sauvignon is a variety, and Cabernet Sauvignon is also a cultivar.
And a cépage.
And a cépage, and a variété.
Okay, next question, which actually leads on quite nicely from the previous one. This is from Eric, so thank you for leaving your name. Are there any indigenous vines, or cépage, in South America? This might be a question for Gregory.
This was because we got some of the questions beforehand. I'll say that for me personally, this was the most interesting question for me. I actually went and did a little research on it because I was curious. I did not know the answer to this question, and as far as I can tell, there are none. The Vitis, there's a lot of indigenous varieties to North America. They're not Vitis vinifera, the species that we make wine grapes out of, but there are other Vitis species, and there are many. And as far as I found, their range went so far south as for a couple of species to Central America, but they never, as far as we know, I think they never crossed over into South America. And so we don't actually, there are no indigenous varieties to South America. All the varieties that are grown there are ones that were introduced either from North America, which of course are not typically used to make wine, or they're varieties that were introduced from Europe.
Okay.
What can we expect from vines that we find on plots that have not been maintained for several years?
Which has, sorry, I don't.
How are the vines in plots that haven't been maintained for some years?
Oh, I saw this situations in some vineyards in South Africa where people, for economical reason, did not crop some vineyards over a few years, and you end with a sort of minimal pruning, meaning you end with a bush, because the vines were previously pruned. So you end with a bush, which we sort of bushes, and the vines are able to regulate and to balance themselves up to a point. So from and then you can recover by again doing new pruning and stuff like that. The main problem was not about the vegetations or the cropping. It was more about diseases, because as they did not use those vineyards to crop, they did not spray chemicals against mainly mildews. And that did really damage the vineyards, and that did compromise the future of the vines. So if you don't want to use the vineyards for many, many reasons, you still have to maintain a bit of maintenance by spraying against diseases, I suppose.
Okay.
I completely agree with Alain. And in some parts of the world, when the economics are down, people they just stop pruning the vines and working on the vines, because they say, well, maybe the economy will be up in 3 or 4 years, so we don't pull up the vines, we just leave it, and actually they just spray. The important thing is spraying. And I saw this, for instance, in New Zealand, when they planted at one stage too much Sauvignon Blanc, and where people just, so hundreds of hectares, they just didn't prune them or harvest them or whatever, because the price was too low to make it worth working there. But they continue to spray. They say, okay, when the economy is up, we can recover the vines. The only thing of which the vines can die, the vinifera vines can die, they're very susceptible to downy and powdery mildew. In particular with downy mildew, they lose their leaves. So if you have early in the season attacks from downy mildew, they lose their leaves, so the vines cannot build up reserves, and then they eventually decline.
Okay. I think we perhaps have time for one more question. So I open this up to any of the professors. Is there a possibility that we can go back and discuss grafting and phylloxera?
So you mean not to graft?
So our reasons for grafting and why
Yeah.
in what circumstances we would not graft.
I suppose, well, Greg and Keith will complete, but I suppose that actually in most vineyards in the world it's necessary to graft because of phylloxera. Phylloxera is still there. Now, having said that, in some regions, in Australia and in Chile, if I'm correct, well, in Australia I know, they don't graft because there is no phylloxera, like in New South Wales or in South Australia, while in Victoria, in Australia, they do graft because the phylloxera is there. So it's still a risk, even if you don't have phylloxera. You always can have the risk to get phylloxera once, or sometimes, even if you take all precautions. So, yep, Greg and Keith, do you want to add on top of that?
No, that's pretty much the case. Everywhere is grafting. I guess I would just add that we've been grafting grapevines for more than 100 years now to alleviate phylloxera, and grafting now has taken on other importances though, because all rootstocks are phylloxera resistant. So now growers use rootstocks in different ways to increase the drought resistance of the vines, or to primarily modulate the vigor of the vines, or how big the vines get. This is something that's different between different rootstocks. So I think a lot of times now grafting, since they're all phylloxera resistant, grafting is more a question of adapting the growth of the vine for whatever management strategy you're trying to achieve. And I just asked Kays the question of whether or not there's some regions in France that don't graft vines, because I think that was on the pad. And indeed, Kays said there's a very small region in Armagnac.
A couple of hundreds of hectares where the soils are so sandy that they don't need to graft in the center of the Armagnac region, but it's just a curiosity.
Yeah.
No, I agree.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. That's all we have time for. And thank you for your participation, for asking questions. Thank you, professors, for being here and answering. And we will be here next week with the viticulture model and another live for all your questions. And yeah, see you next week.